The room was already heavy before the laughter came, weighted with the kind of quiet that only exists when powerful people gather and pretend they are relaxed. This was not a concert hall and not a television studio. It was a private industry dinner in Los Angeles in the early 80s, a place where legends mixed with executives, where smiles were practiced and respect was often performative. Dean Martin had learned long ago how to read rooms like this. He had survived Hollywood when it was ruthless in public and cruel in private, and he carried himself now with the calm of a man who no longer needed to prove anything. He was older, yes, but age had sharpened him rather than softened him. He sat back in his chair, listening more than speaking, watching how people leaned forward when money talked and leaned back when conscience entered the room. This was not Dean's first time navigating tension. In part one of this larger story, he had already stepped quietly into a moment of injustice, choosing restraint over spectacle and dignity over applause. That choice had rippled outward, earning him both respect and quiet resentment from those who preferred their power unquestioned. Tonight felt like a continuation of that same current, deeper now, more dangerous in its subtlety. The industry had changed, but not enough. Faces were more diverse, yes, but control still sat in the same hands. And in the center of the room sat Michael Jackson, young, brilliant, already carrying the weight of the world's expectations on his shoulders. Michael was laughing when Dean first looked directly at him, not mocking laughter at first, but the light, reflexive laugh of someone used to being underestimated and deciding to brush it aside. Someone at the table had made a comment, the kind that pretended to be playful but carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood. It questioned whether Michael's success was real or manufactured, whether his artistry was his own or simply the result of clever marketing, whether he was truly an equal in a room filled with older white men who had defined what great looked like for decades. The comment had been framed as a challenge, almost a joke, but everyone felt the intention behind it. Dean felt the shift immediately. He had seen this before, though the faces had been different. In the 50s and 60s, he had watched talented men and women boxed in by labels, dismissed before they spoke, laughed at so that no one had to listen. Racism in Hollywood rarely announced itself loudly. It preferred whispers, smiles, and plausible deniability. Dean had survived that era by keeping his dignity intact, by choosing his moments carefully, by understanding that the most powerful response was often the quietest one. He watched Michael now, saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his laughter came a fraction too late, a fraction too loud, as if to signal that he was unbothered. The challenge came fully into the open when one of the executives leaned back, swirling a drink, and said with a thin smile that Michael's music might be popular, but popularity was not the same as legacy. The word hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Legacy was a word that belonged to men like Dean Martin, men whose names were already carved into history. Michael laughed again then, a quick sound, sharp at the edges, and replied lightly that he was just happy to make people dance. Some people chuckled, others nodded, satisfied that the young man had stayed in his place. But Dean was not satisfied. He had not survived decades in Hollywood by mistaking politeness for truth. He saw the injustice clearly now, not in the form of shouting or slurs, but in the quiet humiliation of reducing genius to novelty. He also understood the danger. If he spoke too forcefully, the room would close ranks. If he stayed silent, the message would be clear. This was acceptable. Dean had always believed that silence could be either cowardice or power, depending on when it was broken. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he waited, letting the conversation drift, letting the executives congratulate themselves on their cleverness. He took a slow sip of his drink, his movements unhurried, his expression unreadable. This was part of his authority. He never rushed to be heard. When he finally leaned forward, the shift was almost imperceptible, but the room felt it. People had learned, over years of watching him, that when Dean Martin chose to speak, it was worth listening. He addressed Michael first, not the men who had challenged him. His voice was calm, warm, carrying the easy rhythm that had once filled nightclubs and television screens, but there was steel beneath it now. He said that making people dance was no small thing, that joy was not an accident, and that sustaining it took discipline, intelligence, and courage. Michael smiled politely, still half in performance mode, unsure where this was going. Dean then turned his gaze to the table, to the men who had spoken so confidently about legacy. This was the turning point, though it did not announce itself as such. Dean did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply asked a question, the kind that could not be laughed away. He asked how many people in the room could honestly say they had changed the sound of music, not once, but multiple times, across generations. He asked how many could fill stadiums with nothing but their name. He asked how many could walk into any country in the world and be recognized not as a product, but as a presence. The room grew quieter with each question, the laughter draining away as the implications settled in. Then Dean said something that silenced the room completely. He said that legacy was not decided by age or by who approved it first, but by who endured when trends faded and excuses ran out. He said that history did not ask permission before choosing its icons. It simply chose. And then, almost as an afterthought, he added that laughing at greatness before it had finished speaking was a mistake Hollywood had made many times before, and never without regret. No one interrupted him. No one dared. The power of the moment lay not in confrontation, but in clarity. The injustice had been named without being shouted. The cruelty had been exposed without being dramatized. Michael sat very still now, no longer laughing, his eyes fixed on Dean with something close to disbelief. This was not the defense he had expected, and certainly not from a man whose era supposedly had nothing to do with his own. The silence that followed was long and uncomfortable. Some of the executives shifted in their seats. One stared down into his glass. Another cleared his throat, as if searching for a way back to safety. None came. The room had changed. The hierarchy they had relied on had been quietly rearranged. Dean leaned back again, the moment already passed for him, his job done. He had not needed applause. He had not needed thanks. When the dinner finally broke and people stood to leave, Michael approached Dean privately. His voice was softer now, stripped of performance, and he thanked him, not with grand words, but with a simple honesty that carried more weight than flattery ever could. Dean smiled, the kind of smile that suggested understanding rather than pride. He told Michael to keep doing the work, to let the noise pass, to remember that respect earned slowly lasted longer than respect demanded. Long after the room emptied, the story of that night lingered. It was not retold loudly. It did not become gossip. But those who had been there remembered the silence, remembered how quickly laughter could die when truth entered the room. And Michael remembered something else entirely. That dignity, when modeled by someone who had already conquered the world, could be the most powerful gift of all. This was how Dean Martin fought injustice in his later years, not with fists or fury, but with presence, timing, and words chosen as carefully as notes in a song. In a world that often mistook cruelty for confidence, he reminded everyone what real authority looked like. And in doing so, he left behind a lesson that outlived the night itself, a quiet testament to the power of standing up without standing over anyone. The room went silent. Silence, Dean Martin knew, was never empty. It carried consequences. It carried memory. And for some men in that room, it carried discomfort they had not felt in years. The dinner ended politely, almost stiffly, as if everyone were eager to escape before being forced to look too closely at themselves. Dean left without ceremony, offering no final remarks, no knowing glances. That was his way. Authority, to him, did not linger to be admired. It moved on. In the days that followed, the industry reacted the way it always did when confronted with quiet truth. No one issued statements. No one apologized publicly. Instead, doors shifted. Conversations changed tone. A few invitations stopped coming. Dean noticed, of course. He always noticed, but he did not resent it. This was the cost of dignity in a business built on compromise. He had paid it before. He would pay it again without complaint. Michael Jackson, on the other hand, felt the moment differently. For him, that night had cracked something open. He was used to applause, to screams, to public adoration that felt overwhelming and yet strangely isolating. What he was not used to was an older man, a legend in his own right, standing between him and humiliation without needing credit for it. Michael replayed Dean's words in his mind during rehearsals, during late nights in the studio, during moments of doubt that fame could not erase. Legacy, Dean had said, was not granted by approval. It was earned through endurance. That idea stayed with him. Weeks later, another industry gathering took place, larger this time, more visible. This one included press, donors, executives, and artists from multiple generations. Dean had not planned to attend. He was tired, his patience thinner these days, his tolerance for performance smaller. But he went because someone he respected asked him to, and because part of him understood that retreating entirely would allow the wrong lessons to settle in. Presence, when chosen deliberately, was still a form of responsibility. Michael was there too, scheduled to speak briefly about a charity project. When he walked onto the stage, the applause was thunderous, but Dean noticed something beneath it. There were eyes watching not with admiration, but with calculation. There were smiles that waited to see if Michael would falter, if the young icon would stumble under the weight of expectation. Injustice rarely repeated itself in the same form. It adapted. The tension returned when a moderator, attempting humor, made a comment about how Michael's success had come surprisingly fast, as if to suggest that speed somehow reduced substance. The audience laughed politely. Michael smiled, poised, practiced. Dean felt the same familiar tightening in his chest. Not anger, but recognition. This was the same game, just played on a bigger stage. This time, however, Dean did not wait for an invitation. He did not rise dramatically or interrupt. When the moderator finished, Dean leaned toward his microphone and spoke as if he were simply adding context. He said that fast did not mean shallow, and that sometimes greatness arrived quickly because it had been working quietly long before anyone noticed. He spoke of discipline disguised as talent, of loneliness hidden behind fame, of how easy it was for comfortable people to underestimate the cost of excellence they did not have to pay themselves. The room responded differently now. There was no laughter. There was attention. Dean had shifted the dynamic again, not by defending Michael directly, but by reframing the entire conversation. The injustice lost its footing when it was stripped of its assumptions. Michael looked toward Dean, not with surprise this time, but with gratitude that no longer needed words. After the event, they spoke briefly backstage. Dean did not offer advice in the way mentors often do, with lists and warnings. He simply said that the world would keep testing Michael, not because he was weak, but because he was visible. And then he added, quietly, that visibility was not something to apologize for. It was something to steward. This second turning did not end with tears or dramatic confrontations. Its power lay in accumulation. Each moment, each word, each refusal to let injustice pass as humor or tradition built something stronger than outrage. It built precedent. People began to hesitate before making the same old comments, not because they feared punishment, but because they remembered how exposed they had felt when truth entered the room without raising its voice. For Dean Martin, this was enough. He did not need the world to change overnight. He believed in small corrections, in dignity modeled consistently rather than demanded loudly. And for Michael Jackson, this part of the story marked a quiet shift from proving himself to protecting his sense of self. The injustice had not vanished. It rarely did, but it had been confronted twice now, not with spectacle, but with composure. And in that composure, something lasting had taken root. Part two ends not with resolution, but with momentum, the kind that carries forward, gathering meaning, preparing the ground for what comes next. A distance from the spotlight, in the quieter corridors of Hollywood, where decisions were made without cameras and reputations were shaped without applause. Dean Martin understood those corridors better than most. He had walked them when they were filled with smoke and bravado, when deals were sealed with handshakes and broken just as easily. Now they were cleaner, more polished, but no less dangerous. After the second public moment, where injustice had been gently but unmistakably exposed, there was a shift he could feel. Not resistance exactly, but irritation. Quiet authority unsettled people who relied on control without accountability. The invitations that followed were selective. Dean was still welcome, but not always wanted. Certain producers suddenly became busy. Certain conversations ended just a little too quickly. This was how Hollywood corrected behavior it could not openly challenge. Dean accepted it with the same calm he had shown all his life. He had reached a point where exclusion no longer frightened him. What concerned him was what happened when younger artists were isolated without realizing it. Michael Jackson, meanwhile, was entering a phase of his career that few could truly understand from the outside. Success had amplified everything, praise and scrutiny alike. After the public support he had received, expectations rose even higher. People watched him not only to see if he would succeed, but to see if he would fail in a way that confirmed their quiet doubts. Dean saw this clearly when they crossed paths again, this time not at a gala, but at a rehearsal space late at night, where exhaustion stripped away image and left only truth. Michael looked smaller there, not diminished, but human. The laughter and composure that once shielded him were replaced by focus and fatigue. Dean did not comment on it directly. He never believed in diagnosing another man's struggle aloud. Instead, he spoke of his own early years, of being underestimated not for youth, but for background, accent, and association. He spoke of how the industry loved labels because labels saved them from listening. Michael listened intently, not interrupting, absorbing the lesson without dramatizing it. The new conflict emerged subtly, as most serious ones do. Rumors began to circulate, not accusations, but insinuations about Michael's creative control, about whether he needed guidance to stay on track. They were framed as concern, but Dean recognized the old pattern immediately. This was how power reclaimed ground it felt slipping away, by questioning competence without evidence, by planting doubt where success had become undeniable. Dean faced a choice now. He could withdraw, protect his peace, let the next generation fight its own battles. No one would blame him, but he had seen too many gifted people broken not by failure, but by erosion. Injustice did not always strike once. Sometimes it wore you down slowly until you doubted your right to stand at all. The turning point of this part came not in public, but in a meeting few would ever hear about. A small group gathered to discuss future projects, and the tone shifted quickly toward control rather than collaboration. Michael was spoken about, not to. Dean sat quietly, letting the conversation reveal itself fully. Then, with the same measured calm that had silenced rooms before, he spoke. He did not defend Michael by listing achievements. He did something more dangerous. He questioned the premise. He asked why a man who had demonstrated discipline, innovation, and global resonance needed to be managed as if he were fragile. He asked whether the concern was truly about protection or about comfort. The words landed softly, but they landed exactly where they needed to. No one answered immediately, because to answer honestly would have required admitting fear, not responsibility. The resolution did not come with agreement or applause. It came with a pause, a recalibration. Decisions were delayed. Assumptions were reconsidered. The room did not transform overnight, but the direction shifted. Injustice, when named without hostility, lost its momentum. Afterward, Michael thanked Dean again, this time with quiet emotion that did not spill over. Dean told him something he had learned too late himself. That survival in this industry required knowing when to speak and when to let your work speak for you, and that neither choice was a weakness. Dignity, he said, was not a performance. It was a practice, a sense of narrowing space, the kind that comes when pressure replaces possibility and every move feels watched. Dean Martin sensed it long before anyone named it. Hollywood had a way of tightening its grip quietly, rewarding compliance with comfort and punishing independence with subtle isolation. After the private meeting where assumptions had been questioned, the tone around Michael Jackson shifted again. This time, it was not concern or mockery. It was impatience. Projects moved more slowly. Approvals took longer. Conversations that once flowed easily now stalled on technicalities. Nothing could be proven, nothing could be accused, and that was precisely the point. Injustice had learned to wear patience as a disguise. Dean recognized it immediately because he had lived through versions of it when power felt challenged but could not strike openly. Michael felt it too, though he struggled to describe it. Fame insulated him from ordinary obstacles, but not from this kind. This was not rejection. It was containment, a suggestion, repeated often enough to feel inevitable, that he should simplify, soften, stay within lines drawn by people who believed they understood the market better than the man creating it. The pressure did not come with raised voices. It came with smiles and phrases like, "For your own good," and "This is how it's always worked." Dean watched from the edge, aware that stepping in too often could weaken rather than strengthen Michael's position. Mentorship, he believed, was not about replacing another man's voice with your own. It was about helping him trust it. Still, there were moments when silence would have become complicity. Dean chose carefully. The critical moment arrived during a planning session meant to finalize a major appearance. Executives spoke confidently about branding, about image, about risk. Michael listened, polite, attentive, increasingly quiet. Dean noticed the pattern. When the conversation turned toward limiting Michael's creative input, framing it as protection against controversy, Dean leaned forward, not abruptly, not theatrically, simply enough to signal intent. He spoke slowly, almost conversationally, recalling a time when his own career had been nearly reshaped by people who claimed to know what audiences wanted better than artists did. He said those people had been wrong then, and that history had been unkind to their certainty. He did not name names. He did not accuse motives. He did something far more unsettling. He reminded the room that control had a habit of confusing itself with wisdom. The room resisted at first. Someone countered with numbers, with demographics, with caution. Dean listened without interruption. Then he delivered the decisive moment of this part, a sentence that did not argue but concluded. He said that if the industry truly believed in Michael's value, it would trust his judgment, and if it did not, then no amount of management would manufacture authenticity where belief was absent. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. Conversation stopped, not because anyone was offended, but because the logic was airtight. To push further would have exposed the truth beneath the strategy. The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was sober. Decisions were postponed. Parameters loosened. Control receded just enough to restore balance. Later, away from the room, Michael spoke more openly than he ever had. Not about fear, but about exhaustion. Dean listened without interrupting, understanding that sometimes the greatest injustice was the expectation that success eliminated vulnerability. Dean told him that power would always test those who carried it differently, and that survival depended on knowing which battles required resistance and which required patience. Distance created by time, by success that has grown too large to be managed quietly, by a world that now watches Michael Jackson not with doubt, but with hunger. Fame at this level no longer questioned his talent. It questioned his endurance. And with that shift came a new kind of injustice, one that Dean Martin recognized as the most dangerous of all. Not humiliation, not control, but exploitation disguised as admiration. Michael was everywhere now. His image, his sound, his presence were treated as resources rather than expressions. Meetings multiplied. Expectations hardened. People no longer asked what he needed. They asked what more he could give. Dean watched this from the outside, aware that his role was changing. Intervention now carried different risks. Stepping in too forcefully could make Michael appear protected, shielded, controlled. Dean would not allow that narrative to form. The injustice surfaced during a tribute event meant to celebrate Michael's influence. The language used was glowing, but the structure told a different story. Others spoke for him. Others defined his meaning. Others decided what parts of him were acceptable to honor. Michael sat through it with composure, but Dean saw the cost. Celebration had become possession. Praise had become ownership. This was the moment Dean chose his final intervention, not because it was the loudest injustice, but because it threatened to erase something essential. When Dean was invited to speak, many expected nostalgia, perhaps humor, perhaps a gentle endorsement of legacy. Instead, he offered something far more unsettling. He spoke of how the industry loved to celebrate artists when it was done using them. He spoke of how applause could become a curtain, hiding exhaustion, loneliness, and pressure behind standing ovations. He did not accuse the room. He did not diminish the praise being offered. He reframed it. He said that true respect meant listening while someone was still alive to speak for themselves. He said that honoring greatness required restraint, not possession. And then he did something no one expected. He stepped aside and invited Michael to speak without framing, without expectation, without protection. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was not defensive. It was anticipatory. Michael spoke briefly, honestly, without performance. He thanked the room, but he also claimed his voice. He spoke of responsibility, of art as service rather than spectacle, of the need for space to remain human inside a machine that never stopped demanding output. When he finished, there was no immediate applause. Some people wiped their eyes. Others looked down. The injustice had been dismantled not by confrontation, but by restoration. Michael had been returned to himself. Afterward, Dean did not linger. He rarely did when a moment belonged to someone else. When Michael found him later, there was emotion in his voice, but also clarity. He understood now what Dean had been teaching all along. That dignity was not something granted by rooms or titles or tributes. It was something protected, sometimes fiercely, sometimes quietly. Quietly, as endings often do, with less noise than beginnings and more weight than anyone expects. Dean Martin was no longer at the center of industry gatherings now. His presence had become selective, deliberate, almost ceremonial. People still spoke his name with reverence, but fewer expected him to intervene. Fewer anticipated his voice to reshape rooms the way it once had. That assumption, Dean understood, was both natural and dangerous. Injustice rarely announced itself at the end of a story. It waited for fatigue. The final conflict did not come from executives or moderators or even institutions. It came from narrative itself. Stories began to circulate, not malicious on the surface, but incomplete in ways that mattered. Michael Jackson was being rewritten in real time, flattened into extremes, either untouchable icon or fragile enigma, neither of which allowed him full humanity. Praise had become overwhelming again, but this time it threatened to erase complexity rather than deny worth. Dean recognized this as the last and most insidious form of injustice. When a man is no longer allowed to be ordinary, he is no longer allowed to be honest. The moment arrived during a televised round table meant to discuss the future of music and culture. Michael was present, carefully composed, visibly aware that every word would be dissected. The discussion veered toward legacy once more, but now it carried finality, as if the room had already decided who Michael was allowed to be. Dean had not been scheduled to speak. He sat off to the side, almost forgotten, watching as others spoke about Michael as if he were an idea rather than a person. Dean felt the familiar tightening again, not anger, but responsibility. This was not about defending Michael's talent or influence anymore. It was about restoring his right to complexity. When a pause opened in the discussion, Dean leaned forward slightly. The cameras caught it. The room shifted. He spoke slowly, his voice steady, carrying the gravity of a man who had nothing left to prove and nothing to gain. He said that legacy was not a verdict delivered by panels or headlines. It was a conversation that unfolded over a lifetime and sometimes beyond it. He said that the greatest disservice done to artists was the rush to summarize them before they were finished becoming themselves. The words were gentle, but they cut through the room with unmistakable precision. Then came the final decisive action. Dean turned to Michael and asked him a single question, not for the cameras, not for the audience, but for the man himself. He asked who Michael wanted to be remembered as, not as an icon, not as a phenomenon, but as a human being. The question landed with a force no accusation ever could. It demanded presence. It demanded honesty. Michael answered quietly, without flourish. He spoke of wanting to be remembered as someone who tried to give more than he took, who worked hard, who cared deeply, who never stopped learning how to be better. The simplicity of it dismantled the spectacle instantly. There was no laughter, no interruption, only listening. The silence that followed was complete, not awkward, not tense, complete. It was the kind of silence that meant something irreversible had occurred. The narrative had shifted. Michael had reclaimed himself, not through defense, but through truth. Dean leaned back, his role fulfilled one last time. After the broadcast, there were no dramatic farewells. Dean and Michael spoke privately, briefly. Dean told him that the world would keep trying to define him and that he would never fully escape that. But he added that definition lost its power the moment a man knew who he was without witnesses. Michael nodded, understanding finally not just the lesson, but the cost and the freedom that came with it. The story ends where it should, not with triumph, but with dignity preserved. Dean Martin walked away from the spotlight one final time, leaving behind not a speech, not a scandal, not a legend polished for comfort, but an example of how justice could be served without cruelty, how authority could exist without dominance, how silence could be broken just long enough to restore balance. And long after Dean's voice faded from rooms like that, its echo remained. Not loud, not demanding, but present. A reminder that the most powerful comeback is not the one that humiliates, but the one that leaves the room silent because truth has finally been allowed to speak.